There are three things that the world needs to prevent a climate catastrophe. Number one, protecting our existing carbon sinks. Then we also do need to green our local and global production, both the production and consumption. And lastly, we do need to be considering how we can remove carbon at scale from the air.
Got my coffee and today's guests here with me, so we're ready to roll. Welcome to the Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be casually talking about everything circular and beyond. Now, my two guests today are from the Climate Action Platform Africa, or CAP-A, which is a platform that promotes climate action in Africa as a driver for economic transformation and job creation. And in that context, CAP-A works to help unlock Africa's potential as a global hub for climate action that actually underpins a new climate smart model of economic growth and inclusive livelihoods. So my guests today are Jack Kimani, the founding CEO of the Climate Action Platform Africa, and Matthew Hill, Green Industrialisation Senior Associate at CAP-A. Welcome to the show, Jack and Matthew.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you here. And maybe to get us started, could you maybe briefly introduce yourself a little bit with your background and your experience, as well as the work you're doing at the Climate Action Platform Africa? I introduced a little bit, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. So, Jack, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share with your listeners about the Climate Action Platform for Africa. My name, as you indicated, is Jack Kimani, and I'm the founding CEO of CAP-A. And as you highlighted, CAP-A was founded on the realization that Africa can be a massive and crucial part of the global action that helps avoid a climate catastrophe. Now, this is not what typically you hear in the context of climate in Africa, but we did feel quite strongly that this very role that Africa can play can also be the path for African countries to be able to move to middle income status and beyond. So they're able to solve for their own development needs, but also address the whole challenge around getting us to net zero by 2050. It's hard to imagine now, but at the time when we are having this conversation, we could not find an organization that was focused on making this a reality, this opportunity as a reality. At least not with the kind of singular focus to drive the transformation that we identify within the continent in a timely manner. My background is actually in finance, but I spent 11 years heading up work with the Clinton Foundation within the Clinton Climate Initiative. And through that work in thinking about how do you enable African communities, African countries to not just be victims. And it's to be clear, African countries have obviously suffered disproportionately from this climate crisis, but also how they can also be solution providers. And thinking around opportunities that carbon markets, for instance, provide, thinking around how you can have sustainable climate finance. And that's partly, what informed even my joining the organization, because you're coming in thinking around, how do you enable that the ideas, the solutions that we know are feasible, how you can be able to anchor that on sustainable business models, how you can be able to anchor that on sustainable ideas that are most relevant and viable for the continent. And so there is quite a bit, obviously, in what CAP-A does that I'm sure we'll be getting into later on.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jack. And I think you're spot on. I mean, the world has been developing that much over the last couple of years, and it's a whole new perspective that I think you're bringing in with CAP-A here. Matthew, let me bring you into the discussion. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a background of yourself and your role in CAP-A.
Yeah, hi everyone, and again, thanks for having me on here. Um, my role within CAPE is a team member in the Green Industrialization team. So what we do is we focus upon sort of sustainable projects in the sort of industrial sector, sort of which broadly speaking covers quite an array of topics. So, for instance, some of the ideas we'll talk about later will be things around critical minerals or green hydrogen, but it's also more broad than that in terms of renewable energies, shipping fuels, more recently, sort of carbon dioxide re- removals. And yeah, as a background, I'm a trained engineer with a master's in chemical engineering, specifically focused on hydrogen fuel cells. Previous to joining CAPE, I was an engineer focused on sustainable solutions. So sort of identifying and implementing projects on a industrial scale, which were specifically focused on reducing energy and water. And yeah, I've been with CAPE for about a year now, and yeah, excited to chat more about it.
Jack, the first question to you. I mean, you mentioned how the world has been changing and how you see and how you're also promoting in CAP A the potential that the African continent has in basically the fight against global warming and climate action. What do you see as the key challenges, but on the other hand, also the opportunities in unlocking that potential that Africa has as a global hub for climate action?
Yeah, I'll start by acknowledging that we do at CAPE recognize that Africa does suffer some of the worst consequences of the climate change, despite having contributed the least to causing it. And this is something that is well known, is much talked about reality. So it's not in question. Most folks, I think, would relate Africa and climate in that context. What is less widely appreciated is Africa's potentially crucial contribution to averting climate change. And if you think about it, there are primarily three things, at least the way we like to think of it within CAPE, is that there are three things that the world needs to prevent a climate catastrophe and to help in reversing climate change. And this is essentially number one, protecting our existing carbon sinks. You know, what is already standing. Let's make sure that we don't cause any more harm. Then we also do need to green our local and global production, both the production and consumption. And lastly, we do need to be considering how we can remove carbon at scale from the air. And that's across nature-based solutions all the way to some of the emerging engineered solutions. Now, for each of these, the technical feasibility and the commercial feasibility is driven by some combination of three production factors. One of those is renewable energy. The other one is in terms of labor capacity. And the third one is relevant natural assets and resources. Now, it just happens that for all of this, Africa has in abundance, you know, when you think about the young people, we have the youngest and fastest growing population on this continent. We also do have some of the high yield, super abundant renewable energy, untapped renewable energy potential within the continent. And Africa is also home to massive natural carbon sinks. And when you think about, opportunities around agriculture, we have 60% of the world's remaining unused arable land. There are also big deposits, and I'm sure Maddy did mention about this. The huge deposits of some of the critical minerals that are needed for the energy transition. 40% of the global critical minerals are also found here. And then geological formation that also enables carbon storage, applying some of the engineered solution. The challenge, though, is that the rest of the world has not fully yet caught up with Africa's potential. You don't hear this conversation as we've been describing. So the work that CAPE does is to highlight the need for a systemic approach to make all of this real. And that's why we do focus on the various binding constraints for various opportunities and thinking around who do we need to be partnering with, who do we need to be collaborating with, who do we need to bring into the equation that would enable us to move some of these ideas forward. So the way we think in terms of how Africa can help in realizing this opportunity, this climate positive growth trajectory, and contributing to global goals, there needs to be within the continent itself an anchoring of these ideas within the economic growth and development plans. So this cannot be an add-on. It has to be a part of what African governments themselves are doing. And that has to be followed closely by the enabling environment that allows that this can be able to be taken forward. This is the policy and the regulations that will be able to anchor this. Now, there is a need that, there's a global collaboration to help in increasing Africa's share of global investments in, for instance, renewable energy. Currently Africa's climate finance flows remain very low at about 3% of global climate finance. And that is just a number that is not sustainable. And even that, that 3%, it tends to focus on, small scale, fragmented, uncoordinated operations. So the focus needs to shift, to enabling us to mobilize the trillions that are needed by 2030. And then also thinking around opportunities for processing of Africa's raw materials. Africa is largely seen as where you get your raw materials, you extract, and then they're processed, or the value addition is done elsewhere. And this is one of the things that at CAPE and Matthew and the rest of the team have actually been focused on this, thinking about where is this opportunity for local processing of some of these minerals. And we have looked at a few examples of that. I'll just share one as, I let also Matthew chime in on this. Africa has 25% of the global bauxite deposits, 25%, most of that in Guinea. If all you did was locally smelt that bauxite with the renewable energy on the continent, you'd enable that you can save close to almost 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 335 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. You can also generate 60,000 in new direct jobs and another 280 or so, when you combine direct and indirect jobs. And you're also able to generate revenues upwards of $37 billion. And if you think about from an energy standpoint, you help unlock 44 gigawatts of renewable energy electricity capacity, which is suitable for anchor demand, and that anchor demand enabling that then you can also address issues of energy access. Just to give you a perspective of that, the total installed capacity on the continent right now across all the 54 countries is 88 gigawatts. So this one opportunity alone helps you increase that by 50%. So all of these are some of the opportunities that as an organization, we would like to bring to the attention of various decision makers, of different stakeholders. There is opportunities around trade mechanisms that allow products from Africa to compete on fair and equitable terms. There's opportunities around industrial policy that incentivizes, global investments to flow to locations that offer the best and fastest global climate returns, which in this case, you would argue, the best location would be Africa. And then, reducing the cost of capital and how you can be able to focus on various levers that would allow that to happen. So there is opportunities, there's some challenges, but I think we are very much in the camp of let's amplify what these opportunities potentially look like to incentivize that action can be taken to help overcome those challenges.
Interesting, and I think, Jack, you're making a lot of really important and interesting points there. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a huge systemic change we're looking at, and a huge way of rethinking how industry operates, how value chains operate, how we approach topics. And I recently read an article that Africa, the African continent, has a huge potential of jumping a lot of the technological developments that we've seen in other countries and go directly to renewable, to green energy, to green processing. Matthew, let me bring you maybe in your role as Senior Associate for Green Industrialization. how do you approach this integration of sustainable practices into the industrial sector across the continent, as Jack already pointed out and brought an example? How do you look at that? What do you do at CAP-A to basically accelerate that change in thinking, but also in the practices in Africa, but also beyond that? Because I think it also requires a significant mindset shift in other parts of the world.
So I think Jack touched on this, but what we like to say in our team is that Africa has 40% of the global critical minerals. It has 40% of the world's renewable sources, and by 2040 it will have 40% of the workforce at a global level. So if you look at this as a resource, when you actually analyze the data, we're sort of aiming to find solutions that are beneficial on a global scale that could be implemented within Africa. So sort of one of the pieces of work that we did was to show that if you were to have a battery and solar solution, the battery size in Africa, and it's specifically we looked at a spot in Kenya and in Germany, we found that the battery size needed on a sort of on a house size scale, on a industrial size scale, would be half of the size of a battery that you would need in a place like Germany, for instance. So if you look at the resources required for that, it means that half of the amount of resources that you would actually use, you could reduce that number by having the industry in Africa. And so that just tied up perfectly with the circular economy and the principles of reduce. So that's sort of how we try to look at the data and sort of view it more as the resources in Africa rather than the problems.
It's interesting because you're again, as Jack did, you're touching on a lot of the problems we're having at the moment. I mean, on one side, you basically have the climate change. On the other side, a lot of the Western countries have a problem with their workforce that you're basically addressing. We're having problems with resources, and that's naturally something you're addressing with your activities at CAP-A, and basically shifting the production, shifting the work into the African subcontinent with all the positive side effects that come naturally with that. It's not only climate change you're addressing with that, but there's a wide range of other topics you're addressing at the same time. Now, Jack, could you share maybe a couple of success stories of where CAP-A has been involved and where you have been able to really trigger this change and trigger activities that go into the direction of really positioning Africa or repositioning Africa in that context? I think it's more.
No, absolutely. I think it's helpful to start by just describing our approach. So as a system orchestrator, we prioritize on just getting things done. And to get things done, what we have found is that we do need to partner. And so partnering is at the core. Collaboration is really at the core of how CAP-A operates. It's part of our DNA. And we do prioritize that we can focus on results over even our own visibility. So we're not looking to just get CAP-A sort of marketed and sort of at the forefront with our logo front and center. We really just are keen that we can be able to make a difference. So we support key decision makers behind the scenes a lot of times with kind of analytical capacity that helps in generating the type of insights that drive decisions in the right direction, shaping narratives, and that can include supporting with talking points for key decision makers, implementation capacity in some instances to help in realizing kind of the global sustainable, action that we need to see happen. So with this approach, we have worked very closely, for instance, with the government of Kenya through the climate envoy, Ali Mohammed. We, for instance, helped in conceptualizing and shaping the idea of the climate positive growth through his office. We supported him also and his team in shaping, for instance, the Africa Climate Summit last year in September. And as part of that, there was the development of the Nairobi Declaration, one of the major outcomes from that summit, and which was adopted by the African Union, by the way. And as part of so it actually had African Union adopting climate positive growth as its growth and development sort of paradigm. We have also supported a number of different countries in terms of carbon market policy and regulation, Kenya, Zambia amongst them. We have helped countries in sizing their potential and the regulatory gaps for particular opportunities around climate positive growth. And maybe just one more specific example around this. Around 2022, when we started, we were really at the forefront of making the case for a lot of the cutting edge climate tech, such as direct air capture and the potential for Africa, the continent, as a scaling hub. This wasn't a conversation that was being had at the time. And CAPE's founder, James Mwangi, actually did a TED Talk around this time that helped drive this point home, including showing how this could have, the direct air capture opportunity could have substantial core benefits for inclusive growth. So it's not just a carbon removal aspect, but also it helps in providing, for instance, anchor demand that enables the investments in renewable energy within those countries. And so during this time, our work has obviously helped attract attention of various companies focused on carbon capture and storage, and put Africa on the map so that it's no longer just a footnote. And one notable outcome, I must add, of this was an announcement last year by the biggest, really, and only commercial direct air capture player in the world that got into a partnership with a local direct air capture project development player, venture, to help in exploring large scale sort of direct air capture and storage deployment in Kenya. So you trace this to the work from a narrative shaping, from sort of an advocacy at the beginning, leading to the consummation of this type of a deal. And there's a number of different other efforts, in supporting various other initiatives on the continent, including, we helped with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, setting up its African network. It's work that we've been involved in. Really, we are very keen that climate positive growth and the job creation aspects of all of that is something that can take hold within the continent. And so working across the entire ecosystem, working with various governments is something that we are constantly very happy to support. We are constantly very happy to dive into and making sure that this window of opportunity does not bypass the continent of Africa before it can be able to leverage that.
Perfect. And it's great to hear that there's so many activities that are ongoing and that are actually really creating impact, really tangible impact at the end of the day. Now, Matthew, what are some of the strategies? So Jack alluded to the need for collaboration and the need to work with various partners. Now, specifically, if you look at industries, there's a need to work across different industries, across different sectors, in order to drive this more sustainable approach. What are some of the strategies you're employing at CAP-A to foster that collaboration, to be that facilitator between different parties in different geographies, in different industries, to drive this impact that we're talking about on the African continent?
Yeah, sure. One of the tools that we have created is a solar and wind energy dashboard. We created that in collaboration with a company called Delbert Research. It's a dashboard that looks at the entire African continent and sort of lays out the solar and wind potential to a 1-by-1 scale. And by 1-by-1, I mean 1-by-1 kilometers. And how it's different from other tools that I've seen is it specifically uses data that you would get from a solar panel out in the field, or similarly a wind turbine. So we can very much use that tool to sort of have a conversation with our stakeholders and sort of drive the message that we are trying to tell. And then moreover, with tools like this, how we want to take it forward is we want to overlay it with other data that we have. So that data might be sort of areas that we think are favorable for generating green hydrogen, or have high deposit of critical minerals, or show different types of infrastructure. And then what we found is that this can sort of generate the insights that you're looking for in terms of sort of where to have green industry. Jack used the example earlier of bauxite. Similarly, there's a example you can use of the iron ore, and with sort of local production of green steel from iron ore, using the overlays of green hydrogen, you can also show savings of sort of in the hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 on a yearly basis, sort of generating sort of 230,000 jobs, both indirect and direct. So these are very much the tools or strategies that we are trying to implement.
Interesting, and I think you're naturally spot on. I mean, it's not just one industry, it's not just one raw material you're looking at, but it's really coupling the different industries, coupling the different sectors, and give decision makers wherever they sit in the world the data, the insights, the understanding on how they can basically leverage the advantages that the African continent provides in this area to drive, at the end of the day, what will be economic decisions that many of them will be making, but where the African continent can provide these economic advantages in addition to the environmental, the climate advantages that we're talking about. Now, Jack, you mentioned the African Union and the efforts of the African Union already. How do your activities align with the goals of the African Union's Agenda 2063? I think you alluded to it already a little bit, particular in the area of climate action, circular economy and sustainability, but also what do you think the role of international partnerships play in enhancing this agenda and reaching the goals that have been set in that context?
Right. And I would just add something to Matthew's response, just to highlight. Yeah. So what you see us doing is we want to articulate a lot of these opportunities in a quote unquote multilingual way. So we want to present, it's an audience that resonates with the energy opportunity, the job opportunity, the climate opportunity, we can be able to speak to them. And so that sometimes the trade-offs that are seen to be happening with certain opportunities, those trade-offs at least can be addressed in a way that, it's very clear what the upside of all of this looks like. So as earlier mentioned, yes, we help shape the Africa Climate Summit, working very closely with the government of Kenya here. And this was jointly convened by the African Union Commission, the government of Kenya, and with one of the major outcomes from this summit being the Nairobi Declaration, which we helped in developing, and which saw the African Union embracing really the opportunity in climate action for Africa and adopting climate positive growth as a core framing for this. Then you could see how this very much aligns with Africa's Union Agenda 2063, which is about sustainable development. And this is where you're leveraging the comparative advantages that Africa has. So there is quite a complete alignment with the AU on a lot of this. And a key part of what CAPE work is consistently identifying and nudging key stakeholders like the AU towards making climate positive growth a reality. One of the big topics that you'll find on the continent has to do with discussions on MDB reforms, international financial institutions, and sovereign debt, which is a key topic because there's quite a number of African countries that currently don't have any fiscal space. Even as you talk about climate positive growth, they are unable to do much because they're constrained in terms of what they're able to do. And so what we have done, for instance, in an area like that is offering climate positive growth as a missing piece in terms of a pathway for sustainable economic growth. that could also enable that you break a cycle of repeated indebtedness, because the same countries that are finding themselves in this hole were similar in, 30 years ago in seeking debt forgiveness. So you see this cycle just being perpetuated. And we feel being able to give the agency around climate positive growth for a lot of these countries then starts not only to address their own development, but also enabling them that they can get out of this spiral. And this work is also what helped in helped us in shaping, a panel that was put together, an independent expert review panel on debt, nature, and climate, which is looking at how do you bring solutions to debt. How do you bring solutions that enable African countries and others to debt linked to climate opportunities within the continent? International partnerships are absolutely critical. And I think, as I highlighted a little bit earlier, there are 4 categories of action that are identified as part of the Nairobi Declaration. And 2 of those do require that there is international collaboration, the finance and investment especially, because as much as Africa may have a lot of these assets and opportunities, the reality of it, a lot of the capital sits outside the continent. So we do need international collaborations in securing the right type, the right amount of finance and investment into these African opportunities. And this can stretch all the way from, I just talked about creating greater fiscal space, to thinking about concessional international finance, and also domestic capital mobilization within the countries themselves. Another crucial and linked piece to all of this is a fair and equitable market access. This is absolutely key. It's an aspect that sometimes can get lost because it comes in towards the very end. But for African cost competitive solutions to be able to truly contribute to global solutions, they need to have access to buyers' markets. And a lot of those buyers' markets don't sit within the continent at this point in time. Africa definitely can be a future market for a lot of these goods. But so as new instruments and mechanisms are being introduced, being developed in different jurisdictions, they need to incentivize, and these are instruments obviously meant to incentivize a shift towards climate smart business models. They do need to keep in mind, and they do need to be designed in a way that does not, disenfranchise, or at least not explicitly cause African providers to be disadvantaged, or that whatever ideas that are emanating from the continent are not now not competitive because on account of the rules that have been put in. And I have, CBAM, for instance, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which at a high level, it's actually a great idea because it's incentivizing, obviously providing a market, for low embedded emissions goods and services. But then the rules that need to follow, the data requirements, they have to be set up in a way that that advantage that African goods and services might have is not negated because the rules have been set up or the mechanism has been set up in a way that or designed in such a way that African providers are implicitly or explicitly excluded or disadvantaged.
Yeah, and I think it's back to one of the topics we touched upon earlier. It's like the systemic topic. So there's all of these different aspects that need to be considered, basically interlinked. You cannot just look at one topic, the energy, and say, okay, we fix that. But all of these topics, the financial markets, the energy, the industrial sector, all of these things are basically need to happen in parallel. And then you will also see the economic impact. You will see the market developing and so on and so forth. Now, unfortunately, the coffee is empty and it's time to wrap up this episode. But before I let you go, maybe if the two of you could give us a very brief look into the future. Like, what are your thoughts on the future trajectory of basically what we talked about, like Africa as an enabler of positive climate action? of basically the African subcontinent utilizing its potential in becoming a real powerhouse in helping the world address the climate crisis and all the related problems that we're seeing, and with that having a positive impact. So what are your thoughts on the future? Where are we in, let's say, a decade from now, and what's the role that CAP-A can basically play in that development?
So I think just very briefly, there's exciting opportunities for Africa in terms of the technology that will come online. And if you think about it from a circular economy point of view, there's a lot coming ahead in terms of recycling of things like batteries, on things like solar panels. And this sort of really represents a place where there's future innovations that will happen, and very much future jobs that will be created. So yeah, from my point of view, we in for some exciting times. Jack?
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Maddy has shared, and Maddy did highlight earlier, sort of the cost effectiveness, for instance, of some of these, power systems that we have even looked at, comparing some of the locations in Europe compared to locations within Africa, and how that fares very, competitively from a cost standpoint for the continent. And what this does is that it strengthens the case for onshoring the production and processing of, for instance, critical minerals, or manufacturing in Africa for the energy transition. There is not going to be energy transition without a role for the continent of Africa. And I think we need to increasingly, as we speak about this, we need to increasingly also move into implementation, so that a lot of what we already know to be true, we are starting to act on it. And this is both for Africa, but also other stakeholders in other jurisdictions, especially in the global north, coming together, that if we truly intend for us to get to net zero by 2050, there's a location in this world called Africa that can be able to go massively net negative and buy time for other locations in the world that will take some time to be able to decarbonize, to be able to get rid of their old, industries, and allow that Africa can take the lead on that, provide a solution to this global challenge, but then also enable that Africa is able to meet its own development needs.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Jack. Thanks a lot, Matthew, for joining us today. A really interesting topic, and a topic that I think we could have talked another hour about, because there's so many different aspects and interrelations in it. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Perfect. For all of you listening out there, we hope you found today's episode again interesting and inspiring, and it provided you with a new perspective. If you like the podcast, you can help us growing the Circular Coffee Break community by giving us a 5-star rating and a positive review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're getting your podcast. Also, please remember to subscribe to stay in the loop on new episodes, which will be dropping every 2 weeks with a lot of interesting guests. Now, the only thing left for me is to thank all of you for listening today, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here on the Circular Coffee Break podcast.